Hello, I'm Krista McAllister, and welcome to Cerius Leadership. Whether you're growing your business or another area of your life into what you want it to be, I welcome you. I'm here today with John Eli. John's a CEO coach, board member, consultant, and strategic advisor. And I can tell you, all it takes is one conversation to realize the depth of experience he has in each of those areas. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's interesting. One of the most popular blogs I have ever done on our website is what's the difference between a board of advisors and a board of directors? But John, I know you have been on a number of boards. I'd love to talk through the differences between some of those and get into the purpose that they have for the company and the leadership.
Sure. It's interesting that the purpose of boards can vary a lot, and yet there's certain commonalities of it. Currently, I serve on 6 boards. 4 are fiduciary kind of standard boards. One's a board of advisor, and one is it's called a Committee of Business Advisors, a CBA. And that's part of a very complicated trust structure where the stock is all held by Generation 2 in a series of trusts. And the Committee of Business Advisors brings the business expertise to direct the shareholders how to vote their shares. So pretty complicated, long history led to that one. But we also act as a fiduciary representative for the shareholders going between them and the board. And so, for example, the CBA would vote the shares or direct the shareholders technically to vote them if we needed a change in the board or CEO or something of that sort.
Let's start with the fiduciary to make sure that we've got a common understanding of what that means when you say a more typical board.
Yeah.
What is the purpose or the meaning in this context of a fiduciary?
So fiduciary has to operate in the best interests of the shareholders. And to some extent, I would say the enlightened self-interest, because sometimes shareholders can act in their own individual. They don't have a fiduciary responsibility, but the board does. So a shareholder may act in a way that's in their own personal interest, and the board needs to kind of decipher that and determine what's in the interest of the shareholders collectively and what's in the best interest of the company. If you think of the company as the golden goose, some people want a lot of eggs, and that damages the health of the golden goose. So you need to balance all of that. Board of advisors, on the other hand, can give guidance, but I think it should be fiduciary, but not legally required to be. And the one board of advisors that I'm on, we talk about that, and the board agrees to act in a fiduciary manner. So the big difference becomes with a board of advisors, leadership doesn't have to do what you say. They can just take it as advice.
So,
Whereas fiduciary, they're obligated to do what the board wants, so long as the board is acting in the best interest of the shareholders.
right, that's one of the more surprising things too, because I work with a lot of business owners, and the comment is, I don't want a board who's going to tell me what to do. Very big difference between a board of directors where there is a legal obligation and an obligation to do what is directed or requested, or you do have the authority to make management changes, versus a board of advisor where you really are there more to support the leadership for them to make those right decisions. Am I getting this
Yeah, I
correct?
think that's true. When I get told that, I say, well, I think you'd be better off if you did have a fiduciary board, because I was a CEO in past lives for 5 companies over 30 years. And some I had a board of directors and some I didn't. And I always, in my mind, acted as if I did. So I would write a letter to the board every month explaining what happened, what we thought
Mm-hmm.
was going to happen, what was different and why, and what we're going to do about it. So even if that wasn't going to a board, was just going to my file, I found that discipline
Mm-hmm.
extremely helpful in keeping on focus and not getting bothered from the day-to-day interruptions that happen, and letting the urgent over overthrow the important. Um, but I certainly get it that if it's been completely your own show, to suddenly have to report to somebody and answer to somebody, be held accountable, can be unattractive. Um, but your company will be better because of it, and you will be a better leader because of it.
Right. So there is always the option to have a board of advisors, but act as though they are a board of directors and you are accountable to them. That's a different mindset for maybe an owner who solely owns the company most of of the entire time they've owned the company, to be accountable to someone. And yet, to me, that's one of the pillars or cornerstones of great leadership.
Yes. And someday you're not going to own the company, whether it's by a planned exit or by death or disability. And having that structure in place will make the company more valuable to a potential acquirer. And the performance of the company is definitely going to improve with that kind of oversight.
As you're looking at who should be on the board and you're balancing the various perspectives, we talk a lot about balancing your leadership team and the diversity of perspective. Uh, how similar is building a board and putting together those different perspectives and expertise
Yeah.
to a leadership team? Because I know you've built a number of boards. Generally, you're the person they go to say, who should I have on my board?
Yeah. Three of the boards I serve on, I put together. Two of them I chair. And when I set out to do that, it was really what are the challenges the company is facing? So I have one recently put together that they had a lot of HR conflicts. They didn't have good systems. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't have performance management systems. They didn't have a good compensation structure. And so I wanted to get that expertise. And I also like board members to have had experience being a CEO. Because if you've been a CEO and reported to a board, then you're going to be a lot more sensitive to where do you get involved and where you don't. There's a saying in the board world of nose in, fingers out. So you know what's going on, but you're not making management decisions. You're overseeing the decisions that management's making and making sure they get made. And sometimes if you bring in a CEO who's not had a board, they are very decisive. That's what you want in a good CEO, but that's not the role of the board. You give direction of what needs to be done, but then management does it. So that's why I like CEOs who've reported to a board. They're more sensitive to that. This company also had some sales problems, so we brought in another CEO who came up through the sales ranks and now has a sales consulting company. It's very much about process. And then it was a tech company, so we wanted to have another voice that really understood product life cycles and accelerating change and all the things that come with technology. And then we had two shareholders and the CEO make up the board. So we had outside control, but all the stakeholders represented.
And I'm seeing a trend there as to the individuals where they've had the experience, they've done the role, they've been in it on a day to day, but they've since transitioned to doing it from the outside or advising or consulting or being on boards. And they understand the difference between walking someone down the path and helping them get there from the outside and from more of an advisory perspective versus jumping in and wanting to hold their hand and do it with them. Because
Right.
I've seen that with a lot of executives. Some can do it from the outside very well, and some just can't help but put their fingers in.
Once you've been in charge, it's very hard not to be. And if you've been successful, you probably feel you have more skills and knowledge than the CEO in a particular area. But if you act on that, you weaken the CEO and you weaken the company. So you're taking away rather than adding value to it. And it's a hard choice, and particularly if you're directing a CEO that something needs to be done and they're just not doing it.
And I'm curious, I think that you'd have some great insights as to kind of coaching CEOs on how to effectively work with the board. Because I'm guessing you've worked with a number of either first-time CEOs or CEOs first time working with the board, and that's a big transition.
Huge transition. Some of my CEOs I also separately coach. And
Okay.
when I'm doing that, it's about helping them be more successful, which comes into working with the board, as opposed to when I'm wearing my board hat, it's all about making the company more successful. And occasionally those two things conflict. And when they do, we talk about it. It's okay.
Hmm.
I can't go there because what's in your best interest and what's in the company's best interest in this case may not be the same. Like if they're talking about, should I be here or should I leave? I really
Hmm.
can't get into that from a coaching perspective. But I can help them think through how they could better react to those pressures that are making them feel they want to leave, if in fact they're a keeper. So that the job of the CEO includes managing the board. They should be the ones where I'm the chairman. The CEO and I meet prior to board meetings and go over the agenda. We talk about what the action items in the last one meeting were to make sure that they're followed up on. And we kind of collaborate on that, but they should be running the show and they should be providing information to the board so the board can make better decisions. I worked with one CEO who felt that the board all came from outside the industry, so everything they brought to bear was irrelevant. It was only his industry experience, and that it was a waste of his time to have to explain it. In that case, it's going to be very hard for that CEO to be effective and successful long term. He's got to make those board members as expert as he is.
And that's an ongoing debate, whether it's with leadership or with the board. The tendency is I need someone from my industry who understands it and can either one, bring introductions, or two, I don't have to spend time bringing them up to speed. It seems like every month, but it really isn't. Once you're up to speed, you're up to speed.
Right.
Is there a balance that you recommend having, whether you've got them there as advisors or board of directors, having that industry insight or that outside perspective and bringing other industry?
Yeah. It really depends on the company and what their real challenges are. Um, Thinking that seasoned business professionals don't understand the business, I think, is an excuse and a cop out. And
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't take that much to understand what the business is, as long as you're asking the questions. How is this the same as other businesses? How is it different? And the why. And quite often, it's asking that why question that's off putting to the CEO because they can't answer it. If they can't answer it, then pretty quickly that becomes part of the board's expertise. So if a company's floundering in an industry, I've got a company that their technology, they're a product company, the technology is changing rapidly. And we brought in onto the board a couple of people with industry experience simply for that reason. They can understand how is it changing, why is it changing, where can we find places where we fit better. But then we've also brought in outside consultants who can help with that. So you need industry expertise. There's a lot of ways to get it.
Putting the puzzle together.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that's difficult as a CEO, whether you're coming in and there's a board there already, or whether even if you put the board together, you're used to having all the answers, especially if you're a founder or a first time CEO. You really feel like you should have all the answers. Then what's the board there to? Are they there to ask the questions and make sure you have the answers? Or when you don't have the answers, that's okay. That's what we're here to help you with. And it's that you don't need to have all those answers to start with. And we
No.
see that a lot. What's an effective board in those situations where walk into the first meeting, there's a lot of nerves.
When I first thought about what was I going to do after I left my last company, um, the idea of coaching came up, and I really was resistant to it at first because having been a CEO for so long, I'm all
Mm-hmm.
about getting to the right answer, getting it quickly, and moving on to the next issue. And coaching is very different in that it's not your problem, it's the client's problem. It's not your solution, it's their solution. You may not even agree with it. So you've got an obligation, I think, to explain why you disagree with it. And if they don't accept your reasons, then your job is help them be as successful as they can going the way they want to go. And I wasn't really sure I could do that, given where I lived for the past 30 years. So I set about working on it and did a lot of learning about coaching. I've kind of found that not being that driven person, but being more curious is more who I am. And so it's really been a delight shifting careers. And I've learned that asking questions is so much more powerful than giving answers. And if we can get to the right question, the answer is, you're 80% of the way there to the solution. So I like to see board members ask questions, and if the answer is not there, okay, well, let's look into that. Let's try and figure out what the answer to that is. And that's a lot less threatening to the CEO. And we're probably, if they don't have the answers, we're asking questions that they hadn't thought to ask. And that's where opportunity lies.
That's an interesting take on any board agenda. She said the CEO should be managing the board. They then own the agenda, is coming up with what are your list of questions for the board? What during the last month did you have to stop or that you don't have the answers to right away, or that you want to validate your assumption or your answer to, and start with what are the list of questions that you might have for the board?
Yeah. And a lot of CEOs don't want to ask the board questions because they feel that if they don't have the answer, so they're asking the board's going to say, well, let's get somebody who has the answers. If you've been at all effective in driving the financials of the company and the company's doing okay, no board's really going to think about that way, at least no competent board. So they're not going to give you what the answer is and direct you to do it. They're going to share their wisdom and ask you to help figure out how to take that information and apply it.
We'll go back to you really then need a board member who does know how to coach, who knows how to be curious and ask the right questions versus here's what to do, go do it, come back to me, report to me next month on how that went versus go ask your leadership team that same question.
Yes.
Come back and tell us what they said or what the research said, and then we'll have the next part of the question. It's not the get the answer and move on. I get a lot of executives asking me or wanting to be on boards, and how do we get on boards? What recommendations would you give, or what would you say is an effective interview process as you're selecting board members?
So when I'm putting together a board, the first step is to lay out the spec. What do we think the skill sets we need right now to help the company? Because boards don't have to be for forever, and some extent shouldn't be. And then we talk about why do we need those, and is that really outside expertise, or is that we don't have a right person in the right seat on the bus that should be part of, say, the HR department manager's job, engineering manager, whatever it might be. So when we've got the spec for what we want, then it's a matter of interviewing people and trying to get to where do they have the expertise. Once you get on a board, it's easier to get on more boards because the role of the board member is so different from what people's career experience is that having had that experience once, you will make a better board member almost guaranteed. But you can't always find people who've been on boards before. It's easy to find people who want to be on a board. There's prestige, they get to have influence. But it's really, do they have the right temperament for it? And then as you put the board together, it's like any other team that goes through the process of, forming, storming, norming, performing. There's going to be that whole team dynamic going on among the outside board members as well as whoever else is on the board from the inside, management and or shareholders. And so you've got to kind of work through that process. And I usually talk a lot in early board meetings about governance and what everybody's roles and responsibilities are. And particularly if you've got shareholders who work in the company and are on the board, and say a family-owned business. Well, that's 3 different hats with 3 different responsibilities. And they need a lot of coaching to remember which role they're acting in, which hat they're wearing at what point in time. And that's very challenging for people.
And if I can, with family and businesses, there's almost a 4th hat there that we like to remind them on, because you've got their role inside the business, their role as a shareholder, their role on the board, and their role in the family.
Yes.
And those are very different roles and how to separate them.
And that family role changes a lot whether you're talking about a founder and uh, children,
Mm-hmm.
adult children who may be in the company, or you're talking about all generation two or three people who quite often, because of the dynamics of the family and the dynamics of running the business, there ends up being a lot of interpersonal conflict between those people. I've got a couple of companies that have five G2 siblings who really do not see the world the same way. And so we have to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
What's in
And
the interest of the
separating that.
business? Yeah.
And that's the what's the best for the family in your role there? What's the best for the business in your role there? Um, one tends to be easier to change than the other. You
Mhm.
are born into that family, and that is your role. That's it, and especially from generation to generation. I You mentioned the board and some of the role with management. That question comes up a lot as to how much interaction your leadership team or your management team should have with the board.
I think quite a bit because that's the organization that's really running the business. And if you've got a high performing team with a lot of participatory leadership, everybody's
Mm-hmm.
involved. So the board should know who the key players are, what their roles are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what their comp is, to keep all of that functioning well. And it's not just, board, CEO, management team. That's the
Mm-hmm.
whole top governance circle. And those people should be interacting on a regular basis. The board should not be evaluating the performance below the CEO on a formal basis like performance review, but they can give feedback to the CEO on you need more support than you're getting in this area. So that could be more training, that could be a different person, whatever it might be. It could be a consultant, augment.
It's, most, especially founder-led organizations, that's the first time they've created leadership team. Their manager are leading that leadership team. And when you're inside of it on a day-to-day basis, that's tough to see the forest through the trees. And especially as the company grows, the skills and what's needed from that leadership team grows. So just having that additional perspective and insights as your leadership team is maybe presenting to the board, working with the board in some ways, I would think it just takes a load off of all the responsibilities that a CEO needs to go through to have that additional perspective.
And they really can't let that load off until trust has been established between the CEO and the board. And
Thank
so
you.
trust, like everything else, is really critical to making this all work well.
Don, I think that you can see my notes that I'm taking, and the word trust is written in capital letters to on that because we've seen the trust with the board and the CEO and the management team.
Yes.
And being able to know you don't need to be perfect. This is a learning opportunity.
I have one of the boards that I chair. We start the day early before people go out on the road. So we get to meet the people who are doing, the operational side. And then we rotate every 2 years. One of the leadership team members goes on to the board. So they get that experience. They interact with the outside directors. And then we have the whole leadership team join us for lunch and just have a conversation about what's going on, what they're doing, what are their challenges, what are their goals, what are they proud of. And that really helps open communication and develop that trust. We're not these, mysterious ogres who come in once a quarter and then stuff starts to happen. We're really interacting with them.
As you're building that trust, what are some added benefits that you see come out of that? Maybe some spillover benefits that aren't necessarily directly related. Because I've seen a lot of incredible relationships form between board members and leadership teams.
Yeah. If the leadership team knows you've got their back and you've got the best interest of the company at heart, then they're going to listen a lot closer to you. They're not going to play lip service with an answer. They're going to come back and ask questions and be curious back if they don't understand, if they don't see it the same way. So everything can happen faster and much more honestly in that communication. So the trust is really the whole lubrication that makes everything work better. I think in the world, let alone in corporate governance circles.
I've seen those situations where sometimes those board members become mentors
Mm-hmm.
to leadership. They end up being references when they're moving on or they want to move on. They're career coaches. They're so um, even outside of the company, there's uh, they create a bond.
Yeah, and that really can't happen until that trust happens. So that's just one of the benefits of having that trust. Now, the challenge with the CEO is at the same time the board is there to support the CEO in bettering the company, they also evaluate the performance of the CEO, and they're the ones who would make the decision that we need
Mhm.
to make a change. That's always difficult, but if you keep tying it back to what are you really trying to accomplish here? What are the goals for this company? We put together a budget, we all agreed to it, we're not hitting it. Why? What do we
Mhm.
need to do different? How do we get back on track? And so those types of questions, not telling them, you know, you need to go close this account next week, which is, totally unrealistic. And quite likely the board doesn't have enough information to make those directives. If it was that easy, it would have happened already. So asking those questions and then suggesting a path of action that we could consider. What do you think? Come back. What do you want to do? Given what we've talked about, how do you think you can better this problem? Maybe that account doesn't make any sense at all, but maybe we need to get into this line of business, something of that sort.
You mentioned making a change. From both of the perspective of if you're a CEO with the board of advisors, you're part of a board of directors, sometimes you need to change out board members or the board changing out the CEO. What are some of those signs to say maybe we do not have the right mix, we are not being effective in this situation?
On the board level, I think boards should evaluate their own performance. Are the board members contributing? Are they coming to the meetings prepared? Are they making all the meetings on time? Are they providing contacts? Are they doing things to support the management team? And just how is that communication between the board members? And
Mhm.
I've got one client where there's 9 board members. The outside directors have control, but we made one change, an outside director, and the dynamics completely changed. Because the
Imagine.
other group had been together for 5 years, they had gotten to that high performance area. They knew who they could count on to do what, who would play what roles. And then somebody came in and they, had a need to show that they were important. And others didn't feel they were listening. And so we had to talk about that with that board member. And eventually it all kind of lines out. In the CEO situation is if the business, it always comes up when the business is underperforming. So if it's underperforming relative to expectations or not profitable, then it's how quickly and effectively are changes being made to rectify that situation. And if the CEO is struggling with it, then the board can offer help, suggesting consultants, suggesting different strategies. And if none of that's getting implemented and things aren't improving, then it's becoming clear that you've made an effort. It's almost like having in any kind of HR situation there's a performance improvement program, a PIP program.
Mhm.
Um, it's probably different at the CEO level, but being very clear what needs to be accomplished and why to turn the company around. First, by asking the CEO to present a plan, and if they are unable to, then the board recommends a series of actions that would help the situation and provides the resources to get that done, be it outside people or shifting budgets around. And if the work's not getting done and things aren't getting better, then a change has to be made. And it's amazing how quickly things change with a new leader.
Interesting. You mentioned a couple times getting that outside perspective. Over the years, that's probably one of the uh, top calls or top comment I get when they're asking. I get a call from a CEO or a board member. It's we need another perspective. We need it validated. We need some new ideas. Um, Very board driven. This board's being outside perspective. They don't feel that all the expertise and all the information needs to come from inside the company.
Right. And
It's
we,
con- Go ahead.
you know, is that we talked earlier about the importance of industry experience.
Yes.
Um, Good business people who are not locked into this is what I did at company X, so we have to do it here. They're able to say, this is what needs to be done. This is an issue. This is how we'll figure that out. Um, there's a lot of examples of CEOs who've left particular companies, and that company had been very successful. Example is when one of the CEOs from GEO or CEO candidates for GE didn't get the job and moved to Home Depot. Um, the We went and applied a bunch of principles that worked for GE, and one of them was reducing the supplier base and buy more from fewer people so we have more leverage. Now that worked very well for GE, but at Home Depot, people wanted variety and selection. The merchandise was what it was all about, and that became very commoditized and gave a real advantage for a while to Lowe's, who didn't do that strategy. So what works at one company, you really have to understand the why. And a lot of times people don't. They just think that it worked. And so you got to be careful of people who bring in ideas like that and don't really get the why.
Exactly. I love that you used that example. I was heavily involved in that situation during that time. And I don't think you could have pulled a more relevant example I was a supplier to Home Depot at that time. I knew all of the original leadership, the leadership during that and the leadership that came after that. And that really was yes, how we got here isn't going to get us there. But what got GE there isn't what's going to get us there either.
Yeah, I was a supplier to Home Depot at the same time period. So
Oh,
we saw the same thing.
yep. That was a very interesting example. And we see that too with a lot of leaders. And I'm guessing boards, when you bring over your playbook, here's what I did to be successful last time, XYZ, I'm going to implement it here. What's that time period that you do to educate new leaders, new board members, to be able to give them the lay of the land so they know enough to adjust that playbook? Because you do want them to have a formula. That's how you repeat success, but it's got to be adjusted to that situation.
I think, first off, you want to get, besides the other criteria I talked about looking for board members, it's also they're strategic thinkers, that they're not going to do things by rotes. They understand the why, they understand the idea of competitive advantage, and is this really going to help us or not? Um, you can only cost cut yourself to success so far. And so people who've found ways to grow the business that they came from, or businesses that they came from, rather than just, you know, financial engineering, if you will, are going to think about it differently. If the management team is invited and open to sharing industry expertise, and their goal is to make every member an industry expert, there's no reason that should take more than a year to happen. That by the end of a year, a board member should be able to really contribute well. And that's why you should have longer terms for board members, so that you're not churning them all the time and saying we've got a board, but making it unable to govern, because at the time somebody's up for the speed, they're getting moved out again.
What is the general term that you recommend for board?
I think a 3-year with terms not being ending at the same time. So you might lose no more than one board member per year, maybe every other 2 years, and then have multiple terms, probably no more than 3.
Because I can imagine when you're forming the board and everyone's coming in at the same time, if you're staggering that or when they're leaving, or they may not fulfill the full term. You're
Right.
able to
Yeah.
stagger.
Usually when I start them, each of the board members has a different term. So we set up that cycle and say to make that work, one has a 1 year term, but they're almost guaranteed to be renewed, voted back in, so that you do get that longevity. If you get too much longevity, then it becomes the distinction between the board think and the CEO think start to merge, and it's no longer independent. So you want to avoid that as well.
What are a couple of those questions that kind of ongoing you should always be asking yourself as a board member? One, I like that. Do I still have independent think? Am I able to separate and be able to list out, here's how the CEO is thinking, here's how I'm thinking, and here's what the company needs?
And I think other ones is to ask: is the governance getting stronger or weaker? Are the shareholders making bylaw changes for whatever stated reason, but the impact is they're reducing governance,
Mm-hmm.
so that there's less and less ability for the board to have oversight? There's a lot of politics that go on, and people play games, particularly if there's factions within the, say, a family business where one group doesn't agree with the other group, and they're always trying to juggle for power. Um, so, am I able to have an impact on this business, or reached a point where I need to give up and say that they just don't want governance, and it's not being I'm not having an impact here the way I should. If I don't have an impact at this point in my life, why am I going to do it? That's the whole reason I do it.
I look back on the piece of advice I always give is look back on each of those conversations and did anything get accomplished in that conversation other than you being swayed to a certain point of view?
Yeah,
A new narrative was created during that conversation. If either of those two things happen, and that's conversation after conversation, you're getting sucked into a story.
that's a very good way to think about it. I like that.
I'm I'm curious. You've done this for a number of years. You have such a passion, so much knowledge. You've built boards. What is it that you enjoy most about it?
When I see the results start to shift and the behaviors start to shift and the organization starts to act much more like a team, and they're teaming with the board, and like we're enthusiastically all working in a common direction, that's really exciting. I love it when teams become high performing teams, whether it be a work team in the organization or the leadership team or the board, or ideally all of those together. Because when you've got that trust and you've got everybody aligned, um, then it's really exciting. My CEO coaching, I draw a distinction between executive coaching and CEO coaching, because executive coaching is largely about the soft skills: leadership, communication, delegation, all those types of things. And that's part of CEO coaching. But in addition, a big part of CEO coaching has to do with strategy and alignment. Because most often, when I get invited into working with a CEO, they have a frustration about a situation that they need help with. They've been trying to fix it, they can't. What am I doing wrong? What else could I do? First, they have to be the type of people who ask those kinds of questions, because then I know they're going to be coachable. But quite often, they're not aligned with strategy with their management team, who are often closer to the customer and see that the world has changed, or they're not aligned with the customer, who has different demands than they used to and different alternatives. And most of the time, it's both. And so we start off trying to understand what's really causing this problem. What's the different viewpoints out there? And what if the other viewpoints are right? What would we do different? And so those what if questions really open up the thinking and make it much less personal to people. I run into CEOs that are bullies, and there's no point in coaching them, because the best I can do is help them see they're their problem, and then I'm gone and nothing changes. So that was a waste of my life. And I run into surprisingly smartest person in the room syndrome. where we'll start talking and they'll tell me everything they know about leadership and they're certified in this and they've read that book and they believe in this. And I can't get them talking about why they really want me. And I finally do. It's because they're not applying all the stuff they just told me they're experts in. And we
Mm-hmm.
want to coach so they can tell other people they do to reinforce how important they are. And two, when they can't convince their leadership team to do what they want, they say, well, I discussed it with my coach and he agrees, so we're going to do it. And I don't really want to be a part of that methodology either. So people who are trying to find a better way, have self-confidence, can be vulnerable, they're the ones who are going to grow the fastest and are going to have the biggest impact with.
Love it. And that vulnerability is a tough one. Everyone seems to have their own interpretation of it. How would you explain it?
I think it's important to want to get to the right answer regardless of whose it is. And once you say regardless of whose it is, then you can become what might be thought of as vulnerable, but you don't have to be right. You have to get to right. And so you have to be curious, you have to be open to other ideas, you have to test things, you have to be conceptual, and you've got to be willing to do experiments and try things. And if we can get to that right answer, regardless of whose idea it is, we're going to come out ahead.
I love it. One of my favorite sayings is we're not tied to the path, we're tied to the destination.
I like that. Yes.
Get to the destination regardless of the path. And
And for,
I
owner managers, sometimes that's very hard because it's been the strength of their conviction that got them to where they are. If they let go of that, what do they have? Well, my answer is you have huge opportunity because you're only going to be limited by one perspective.
as personally growing a company, it is an emotional roller coaster, as you know from being a CEO and all that I'm sure you've gone through. Uh, what what advice would you give a CEO who has a board, they're struggling to work with them, or is thinking of putting together a board?
I would say that be willing to provide more discipline to how the company is run, both to your people and more importantly to yourself. A lot of times, owner managers try and enforce discipline. People in the company think discipline is a bad word. Discipline is really just doing what you said you would do, meeting expectations that have been established. So, one, are the expectations clear? And then,
Mhm.
if they're not being met, let's determine why. And don't hold somebody accountable for doing something they don't have the capability or resources to do. So if we set clear expectations, we hold people accountable to it, everybody is better off and people like that. The only people who aren't happy with accountability are those who are in over their head and they know they can't do the job. Well, let's figure that out, find a job they can do here or someplace else. Because if you let people ride and don't hold them accountable, that makes everybody else say, well, why should I do the extra effort?
And it's interesting you mentioned we talked about the destination, and it doesn't matter how we get whose idea as long as we end up getting there.
Yeah,
Um, we've got to have the right people to help us get there, and their skills and their abilities and that accountability piece really comes into play to help us get there. Because if you end up with that situation where I don't know which way to go, I don't have all the answers. If you're open to listening, more than ever, you need to be surrounded by individuals who have the skills, ability, and willingness
yeah.
to help.
We live in a world today that is changing so fast and in so many different directions. You can't possibly know it all yourself. I've been a strategic planning student of my whole career. It really, when I was in grad school, it was just coming on board. And at that point in time, I was fascinated because I kind of think that way anyway. So now here's this structured methodology that I can learn about and apply. And at that point, it was all about the CEO was the strategist, nobody else.
Mm-hmm.
They were the only ones who knew enough about the full capabilities of the organization to figure out where they could apply it to get competitive advantage. Um, that didn't last very long because as the rate of change has accelerated, you can't know everything. You can't see where everything is going. Anybody my age who talks to their kids learns about new apps and new solutions, things that you wouldn't otherwise come across because they're outside your world. Well, that's happening to all of us in our business worlds, and staying relevant is important. So strategic planning became a participative process where you got more and more of the people closer to the customer involved, sometimes in addition to just the leadership team. And it's really, strategic planning with SWOT analysis and all those different types of, there's a ton of different analysis beyond SWOT. But they're all to help you think objectively about where your situation in the world is and how can we find a new advantage and how long will the old advantage have a benefit for us? Is it going to become, every benefit becomes a commodity. If we had no change, there'd be no opportunity. Every opportunity would have been figured out and we'd have zero profit because everybody would be competing with each other. That's basic economics. So today it's finding what's the next way we can get an advantage. Is it AI? Is it a different organizational structure? Is it a different communication style? Is it more employee involvement? A lot of it's going to be technology, but social changes are pretty powerful as well.
I'm going to have to quote you on that one. What is the next way we can get a competitive advantage? Because at some time, all advantages become commodities.
It's a really powerful question.
Wow. John, I can see how you've taken those leadership skills that you've developed as a CEO, and you were only able to apply them to one company at a time. You're now able to apply them as an advisor, as a coach, as a board member to 5+ companies
Yeah.
at a time. And you're just multiplying the impact that you're able to have from one to many through the process of developing, supporting, and asking those questions.
Now, you just stated my mission statement. Fantastic.
I'm available for hire, John, anytime. John, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I think that you're one of few people who could share them in the way that you do so succinctly that we can all learn from them and apply them in our businesses. Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure, Christian. And I learn something every time you and I chat. So I appreciate this opportunity today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm sure we will chat again. And thank you so much for joining us here on Cerius Leadership.
My pleasure.